Thanks everybody, and thanks so much Tom for the lovely invitation. I've enjoyed the discussion over the past 2 days very much. So I guess as Malcolm Turnbull surveys the political wreckage of this year, he must wonder what's gone wrong on so many levels. He began the Prime Ministership by promising a return to traditional cabinet government, to being consultative and to the discipline and rigour of collective decision making. He sought to deflect public attention away from the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff, appointing Drew Clark, his former departmental secretary, to lead the Prime Minister's office. And he recalled Martin Parkinson from politically enforced bureaucratic exile to become Secretary of the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet. So Turnbull's benchmark for effective cabinet government, he told Australians, was John Howard. Participants in this conference, of course, will recall that the administrative and organisational arrangements that underpinned the Howard government's longevity and electoral success were actually not embedded during its first year. Instead, as is widely acknowledged, I think, those organisational foundations were laid in the period that followed the travel routes of controversy of September 1997. Mr Howard's septem dies horribilis, as he described them, I'm a child of not classical education without Latin, cost the Prime Minister three ministers and 2 staff from the Prime Minister's office, including Graham Morris, who I think is not with us any longer this afternoon. So changes instituted by the new Chief of Staff, now Senator Arthur Sinodinos, laid the foundations of an unusually stable, highly effective advisory system that supported John Howard for most of his long tenure. And I've long argued that John Howard's pursuit of an organisational response to the problems of his first term was a testament both to his organisational skills, but also from his ability to learn from experience. And I think those abilities became more obvious through the second term, but they were there and nascent in the first. And this capacity and potential to learn and grow into the job, as John Howard did, has become increasingly rare. And this is something that I wrote about last year in Griffith Review. Politics has become increasingly professionalised, practised by people for whom it's their primary career. So it seems paradoxical that recent Australian political leaders have been so ill-prepared to successfully take over the reins of government. None of John Howard's successors have proved capable of harnessing the institutional resources of the Prime Ministership that was so significantly enhanced under his Prime Ministership to govern effectively. So in my comments this afternoon and in the chapter for the second volume of the Howard retrospective series, I'll describe how John Howard built on the foundations of his predecessors to develop a formidable institutional and policy capacity for prime ministerial leadership at the centre of government. I'll argue that his advisory system, which comprised a large and politically focused PMO, a cabinet policy unit, a significant and I think largely underappreciated innovation, and together with the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, facilitated John Howard's dominance over his government and the renowned discipline of his Cabinet after those initial difficulties. But with the benefit of hindsight, which Tom's asked us to do, I'll argue that those hybrid advisory arrangements, which with the support of key advisors, including Arthur Sinodinos, Tony Nutt, Tony O'Leary, Michael Lestrange, Paul McClintock and Peter Conran, and officials like Peter, who'll talk later, that Mr Howard deployed so successfully actually brought with them a range of unintended consequences that have proved problematic for subsequent Prime Ministers. And several of these, coordination problems associated with greater centralisation and problems of accountability, conduct and behaviour of ministerial staffers, were in evidence by the end of 2001. So Tom's asked us to give a personal perspective on the second Howard government. So my research interest in the PMO, cabinet government, and subsequent work that I've done on Prime Ministers, Chiefs of Staff, transitions of government and so on, began when I returned to study as a 31-year-old mother of 2 at Griffith University in 1999. My PhD, I'd worked earlier in the Commonwealth and in the Queensland public sectors, so I returned to study as a sort of a late career academic. And I My PhD, which became my first book, Power Without Responsibility, that Philippa published with UNSW Press and that John Nethercote suggested the title for, was published in 2007, and it traced the development and evolution of the ministerial staffing system from its, informal beginnings under Whitlam through to Howard, and some of the dilemmas that were posed by the emergence of ministerial staff as a powerful but sort of constitutionally anomalous force within the Australian core executive. So I started my work at around that time, and I was well advanced by the time the Children Overboard controversy broke. As a researcher, of course, this was fantastic for me, so sorry for people who had that experience, but it was fantastic as a researcher. Subsequent reviews and inquiries, including 2 Senate committees, yielded data that was very useful to me in this developing project. But they also provided, I think, quite important opportunities when you're working in a domain like this to participate and become engaged in the debates that followed, including with key actors on both sides of politics, many of whom assisted and contributed to my subsequent research. It's quite a hard line to walk doing executive studies and maintaining a very careful line to be non-partisan. And I think, part of the success that we've had with the Chiefs of Staff project and others is sort of a testament to our efforts to do that. My analysis, including of this period now that we're looking at, 1997 to 2001, is informed by that original research and by 2 subsequent projects. These were first a study of Prime Minister's Chief of Staff, which involved individuals who'd held the role from Malcolm Fraser to Kevin Rudd. The research for which was conducted in 2009, but then it was quite hard to publish, actually, because everybody wanted to know what had gone wrong under Kevin and Julia, and then everybody wanted an expose of what was happening in the early Howard years, in the early Abbott years. So it was quite hard to that no one was much interested in the work, which was what we were interested in of government. They were much more interested in pathologies such as they saw them. And another book that I did with my colleague Patrick Weller, Learning to be a Minister, gave us some other insights into the transition of the Rudd government and then the Howard people on the way out after their experience. 3 of the Howard Chiefs of Staff, Nicole Feely, Graham Morris and Arthur Sinodinos, participated in the Chiefs of Staff study, along with David Kemp. Discussions with them, and in fact with all of the individuals who held that really unique job in Australian government from 1975 to 2008, both then and in the period leading up to publication, provided incredibly important insights into the ways Prime Minister's advisory arrangements function to both support the office but also the person who holds the office, and to help them to cope with the pressures, the vulnerabilities and the dependencies that are inherent to the job. So that's my personal reflection, Tom, and with that as background, let me quickly move on. So we heard yesterday, and Tom talked about this in his overview paper as well, that the coalition took some time to adjust to being in government after 13 years in opposition. A combination of ministerial and ministerial staff indiscipline and inexperience, early tensions in the relationship with the media and the public service accounted for some of its difficulties making a successful transition. But what's interesting, and potentially a contrast with more recent Prime Ministers, is that Howard had thought a lot about the kind of government he wanted to run, how he'd manage the business of Cabinet, and how he'd try to balance short-term demands with longer-term priorities. He'd been Treasurer in the Fraser government, as people are well aware, and he'd drawn quite a lot of lessons, actually, from his loss of the opposition leadership in '89, and had contributed to the Liberal Party's soul-searching after the devastating loss of the unlosable election in 1993. And I spent a lot of time in my PhD work and the book looking at the Valda report and what an important document that was in thinking about and capturing some of that thinking. But although Mr Howard brought with him strong ideas and theories about how he wanted to govern, it was really very difficult to give them effect in that early period. I think it was when Arthur Sinodinos, Australia's longest serving Chief of Staff and widely regarded as its best, when he took the role, that really helped the Prime Minister to shape arrangements to pursue his agenda and his priorities. Now, the travel rorts controversy was a formative experience, I think, for Mr Howard and for his senior staff. And Arthur Sinodinos told us that the lesson that they drew was that you've got to keep dominating the agenda and moving the agenda forward. With his support faltering and facing open speculation about his competence and fitness for the leadership, Mr Howard took decisive action to bolster his government's political skills and personal staff support. He began with a major restructure of the Prime Minister's office. In 1998, the office was reorganised into 5 functional areas under the leadership of the Chief of Staff. And descriptive details about that are available in the book. But the personal staff had Tony Nutt as Principal Private Secretary and personal secretaries, an advisory group, sort of between 10 and 12 advisors with senior advisors in substantive policy areas, a program coordination and event management group, an administration group, and then a press group that people will recall was headed by Tony O'Leary for a long time. Staff numbers in the PMO grew gradually from about 30 at the start of the tenure through to about 47 by 2007. Now, a second key element of the Prime Minister's advisory arrangements was the Cabinet Policy Unit. And it was established as one of the first decisions in 1996 with a politically appointed head as Cabinet Secretary. The CPU's purpose was to act as a link between the PMO and PM&C to help ensure that proposals fit the governing party's philosophy and strategic directions. This was an idea that had been in development for a long time. Another function was to provide the Prime Minister with an independent stream of advice on Cabinet issues separate to what he received from others. Successive heads of the CPU became pivotal within John Howard's system of advice. They reported directly to the Prime Minister and they were treated at about remunerated around the same level as the Chief of Staff. Now, I said before, and I think this is really true, that the CPU was a very significant innovation whose strategic importance has not been understood. It reflected John Howard's view that Cabinet was a political structure, a committee of ministers, and that the running of Cabinet, the management of its business, and the interpretation of decisions, I think importantly, was essentially a political rather than a bureaucratic function. And of course, when we were doing the Chiefs of Staff work, Arthur told us that the CPU's role was crucial to his role as Chief of Staff. It relieved him and the PMO of responsibility for longer term strategy, allowing the PMO to focus on the tactical and day-to-day matters, and it insulated it from dealing routinely with the public service. It enabled Arthur, as Chief of Staff, to focus on being principal advisor to the Prime Minister, including managing relationships and dependencies across the ministry, the party room, the parliament, and with stakeholders. And if we think about what more recent Prime Ministers have lacked, I think there's a good deal of it in that. Now, although subsequent governments have maintained a politically appointed Cabinet Secretary, now a minister since the Rudd government, no one has really reinstated a Cabinet Policy Unit in that form after Kevin Rudd abolished it in 2007. I think this is a big mistake, since it's increased the burden on an already overloaded PMO. And we can perhaps talk more about this during the questions, but I've been surprised by the shift under more recent leaders to more hierarchical, less distributed arrangements that create unmanageable burdens on the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff. And that just wasn't the case in governments that have been more successful. You had a more distributed arrangements across a troika or a group of senior people. I'll leave it to Peter Shergold to talk about the public service as official advisor within the hybrid system. I just want to note 2 things. And first and importantly, the trajectory of the advisory arrangements that were developed under the Howard government were broadly consistent with trends internationally. Everywhere across all different types of political systems, we've seen growth in the private staff around First Ministers. We've seen centralisation of decision-making under the pressures of governance. We've seen politicisation, which is a contested idea, but this is how it's often described in the literature. The advent of partisan advisors is how I think of that more helpfully. And hybridisation, an awful word, but the blurring of, or the presence of partisan and non-partisan sources. And in a way, David, what you were describing was a bit like that, a mix of advisors, and why wouldn't that be so? Second, and significantly, this latter point, hybridisation, this blurring of boundaries between politics and administration, looms as a key dilemma, I think, for Westminster-style systems internationally. And indeed in the UK, the relationship between ministers and their bureaucratic advisors is described as the great unresolved constitutional question. Now, of course, Section 44 might be that in our own context, but I would argue that much the same is true here. I've been spectacularly unsuccessful in persuading members of the political class that we need to have a look at the demand side of the relationship and think about how well they're served by the arrangements that have developed sort of effectively beyond the capacity of current norms and traditions to deal with them. In the recently published second volume of their, I think, terrific history of the Prime Ministership, Paul Strangio, Paul de Hart and Jim Walter argue that the developments that strengthened prime ministerial capacity under Hawke Keating and which John Howard perfected contained within them the seeds of current fragilities. This provocative and I think pretty prescient thesis behoves researchers like me to consider the unintended consequences of the arrangements that John Howard bequeathed to his successors and which none of them have been able to master. And if my Griffith Review piece, as David will know, I looked at his review in Victoria, where many similar dilemmas were identified. Strangio, Hart and Walter argue that in the right circumstances, the significantly augmented political machine that now surrounds the Prime Minister, which Howard perfected to entrench prime ministerial government, amplified good leadership. Yet there was an inherent asymmetry from which public servants bound to systems of accountability and transparency from which private staff were free, in challenging situations where staffers had the last word, or could act as gatekeepers for the inner circle, they could have disproportionate influence with little fear of the consequences. When hubris or conviction on the part of the leader overcame prudence, then the loyalty of staffers to the boss, rather than to the public good, could reinforce poor decisions. Even a leader of great self-control, experience and shrewdness could succumb. Those who lacked Howard's self-knowledge, experience and political nous, they argue, would find the going much tougher. And I think I'll leave that for you to ponder. Now, Tom mentioned that the Children Overboard controversy, which dominated the 2001 election campaign and much of the third term of the Howard government, will be the focus of next year's conference and the book that will come out of that. I won't revisit the details here, except to say I think Strangio et al. Are spot on. The Children Overboard controversy did expose and lay bare the uncertainties and problems created by that political administrative blurring in the hybrid model. The Prime Minister's refusal to concede or give oxygen to criticisms about integrity, and I understand the political reasons for that, revealed problems that I documented in the book about accountability, behaviour and conduct, but also the fit of this new actor within the core executive that we really don't have a constitutional theory to accommodate, even though practice has long outstripped theory. Now, I've written a lot about the drivers of why greater numbers of personal staff, and I have no problem with that at all. I can entirely understand the drivers. But what I am concerned about are its unintended consequences for continuity, institutional memory, and leaders' capacity to learn, particularly since the move to the new Parliament House in 1988. Now, I was here a few months ago at the Democracy 100 dinner to mark the 90th anniversary of this beautiful building. And some of you might have seen, or I might even have been here, I think, Prime Ministers Hawke and Howard interviewed by journalist Annabelle Crabb. Both lamented the rise of the career politician, the demise of the parliamentary apprenticeship, and the relative lack of diversity of experience, not to mention gender and other characteristics that I'll just, wave through, among our elected representatives. Ironically, and I imagine unintentionally, the Howard government's elaboration of ministerial staffing arrangements entrenched the then nascent publicly funded career pathway to professional politics that so many members and senators on both sides have dutifully followed from student politics. Under the Howard government, the practice of senior officials being seconded from departments to political offices, which under Hawke and Keating was at around 70% and was regarded as essential professional development for aspiring secretaries, diminished. And it's something I think is worth talking more about in terms of the more distant relationship between ministers and their departments and the lack of that opportunity for career development on both sides. And that might be an opportunity to come back to with Peter. So to conclude, and in retrospect, I think it's clear that from 1998 to mid-2001 was really the sweet spot of the Howard government in terms of its ability to set the policy agenda, to recover the initiative when inevitably crises and inevitable events brought the potential to throw the government off course, to coordinate and to project discipline and coherence across the ministry. And that term sweet spot, the chiefs of staff all talked about that, whether you can get the government to kind of a sweet spot, and it lasts, but it doesn't always last for that long. But I think we can talk about this as that time. The advisory arrangements developed to support John Howard's leadership and the functions of Cabinet underpinned and enabled the Prime Minister's performance and success. Now, my research suggests, over a long time, suggests that an effective Chief of Staff, which Howard undoubtedly had in Sinodinos and others, that a PMO, so a good Chief of Staff and a good PMO are necessary, but they're not a sufficient condition for successful leadership. They can help a Prime Minister with whatever he or she wants to do and with how to do it. What an advisory system can't do is help a Prime Minister who doesn't have an agenda, who lacks organisational skills, support and authority within their own party. So similarly, and to kind of circle back to where I began, invoking the Howard approach is insufficient to project capacity and to replicate his success. You have to do much more than that, than just to talk about it. Instead, much as the former Prime Minister did himself in the long years of opposition, they might do better to reflect and draw lessons about governmental effectiveness and developing the organisational capacities and skills needed to exploit those enhanced resources available to contemporary Prime Ministers. I didn't go over time.
Is this a, Jerry Wheeler, I was going to say, is this a personal statement? No, it's question. Please, wait till the microphone comes.
Thank you very much. My name's Jerry Wheeler. I was a member of the Howard office, and it was the greatest privilege of my life. It's as simple as that. It was the greatest privilege of my life. And why, first of all, I want to thank you for the presentation. I think it was very interesting indeed. And what people perhaps don't understand is that why I think it was such a great office was because we had such a great Prime Minister. And that is what drove the office.
Sure.
We had such enormous and unified respect for the Prime Minister that we operated together effectively. Mm-hmm. And we were very lucky to have in Tony Nutt and in Graham Morris and in Arthur three wonderful people who shared our respect for the Prime Minister and wanted to see his agenda enacted. And people used to say of Ronald Reagan that he never took his jacket off in the Oval Office. And metaphorically, I think the same applies with Mr. Howard, that he was always on the job and he had immense respect for the office of Prime Minister. And that is one thing he engendered in his staff. And it was really important for us, to be frank, not to get above our station. Mm. And I think people since have done that. We weren't, Mr. Howard was the Prime Minister, it wasn't us, it wasn't anything.
Do you want me to comment on that? People
Yes.
getting above their station?
Just a few quick points, but yes, I do. But okay. I just want to say a couple of things about political staffers then. I think it's really important that there be contestability of ideas.
Absolutely.
Contestability was incredibly important, but it was built on respect. We had such a good relationship with the Department of PM&C through the leaders that were then there, that they were all, there's a very strong bond between the department and the office. All of the officials were treated respectfully. Never was a piece of advice not encouraged, and I think that relationship was really important. But I just want to conclude on one final point, and that is that I think it was really important to have a strong philosophical compass, and that is what staffers provide. But provided that relationship is built on respect, I think it can work well. I mean, I regarded my job as the keeper of the Conservative flame. That was my job. And I think when you work that with an effective and respectful team, you can deliver good government, and that is precisely what Mr. Howard did.
Well, I think all of that is, recorded in the empirical work that I've done over a long period of time. And I think this is why I emphasise the organisational response. In the course of the American literature that you reference, the presidential studies literature, talks a lot about organisational skills and capacity as a very important trait that presidents need to develop. Prime ministers used not have to worry about it so much because their private offices weren't that big, their systems weren't that big, they had departments who did that stuff. As we have a more blurred tradition and we have larger numbers, then it creates managerial pressures, and so that organisation, that capacity to organise, that capacity to signal, set a philosophy. Mr Howard was very critical of the Keating office, as you know, Jerry, because the staffers had an identity of their own. And it has struck me and others, or the Chiefs of Staff cohort when we were researching the book, that they were very disturbed about the development of the Chief of Staff as celebrity, of an unelected person as having some kind of status and that it is independent of. Because staffers don't exist in constitutional theory, they're an extension of their minister. They're an extension of the Prime Minister. So I won't contend with you on keeper of the Conservative flame. I think the leader has the philosophy, and David Kemp's probably better to respond to that. But I think, I certainly think that the features that you've emphasised are what people think they're invoking when they talk about returning to traditional cabinet government. I don't know that they've understood what it takes to do that.
Question in the front.
Thanks, Anne. Nice presentation. Just a question, aware of any research that compares the number of ministerial advisors in Australia compared to, say, Canada and the UK, New Zealand, that sort of thing?
Yeah, it's an appendix in my book in 2007, and I probably haven't updated the numbers for a few years, but Australia has the largest, and along that spectrum we're the most evolved. And of course, if you think about the hysteria and the hand-wringing about the Blair government having sort of 81 special advisors, it's kind of interesting how in Australia it has not been that contentious a development. It's been, there have been breakouts of concerns about accountability or whatever, but actually the rationale for people needing to have private office staff has, I don't think, been that controversial, and the public service has long since conceded that debate. But I do think the greater numbers and this creation of a publicly funded labour market program into career politics is something that we need to be concerned about. I don't think that was ever intended. I don't think it was actually really intended to be a long-term career. I think it was intended to be an important opportunity to contribute. And increasingly what we're finding, of course, with the nature of modern politics is it's a young person's game, because older and more experienced people just don't want to live in a 24-hour media environment. So that's an issue. That's a very significant issue for attracting the calibre of people who you... Yeah, no, I think it's a really important point. Oh, well, you're welcome to make valid, affirming points.
Your name?
Essentially a product of the media cycle. Prime Minister's offices in the last 30 years have gone from being able to take consideration of an issue to respond to the media in days, now it's literally in minutes. Yeah. That's put enormous pressure on flexibility and an office to seek more or quicker contestable advice on an issue than their predecessors.
Yeah, and I think, of course, that's a very important shift. I mean, it's an interesting question that that the Strangio and Co book, puts up about whether the expectations that were created in that era of the Howard government about what prime ministerial leadership could do in that context at that time are sustainable in the kind of media environment, social media environment, lots of those developments that kind of followed. I think it's a very interesting kind of thing to ponder. I think that is why having something like the Cabinet Policy Unit was so important, to actually just create some organisational space to do the philosophical, forward-term thinking. And this is what people tell us they have no opportunity to do now. And so that's why I'm confounded why those lessons haven't been drawn. I kept waiting for it to appear, or in some form or another, and to my knowledge it hasn't. Of course, Tony, there's still time to do a second edition of the book. we might be able to get to the new ones and look at the kind of more contemporary dilemmas. But I haven't really, it's very hard to talk to the more recent people about their experience because they're so scarified, frankly, and it's become, so tribal and difficult. But the performance of the office is inextricably linked to the performance of the Prime Minister, and so that managerial kind of dimension, I think, is incredibly important. I've wondered on the media side whether the growth of so many media people all competing for the ear and the attention actually takes on an organisational dynamic of its own. Like, I think there could be a bit of kind of, chasing your own tail, a bit of Stockholm syndrome, as the Bligh people in Queensland described it when we sort of looked at similar things. You can't caught in the bubble of this constant media thing. Is that real, or is it because you're just constantly in a hothouse environment like that and you're all 25? Well, you're not all 25, but... Yeah.
And the last question.
Thanks, Anne. Tony Nutt, Wicked Political Advisor.
I've never constructed people as wicked, Tony.
No, I'm not saying, I'm not quoting you. I'm making a joke, perhaps poorly. And look, thank you for your paper. You're a substantive and significant writer and thinker and senior person in this field, so you are held in just and high regard. Just a couple of observations. I've said this to you in a letter a couple of years ago when you invited me to participate in this process and I declined, that I'm a Hasluckian.
Yeah.
That is to say that, like Paul Hasluck in The Chance of Politics, for those of you who have read Paul's book, I've seen too many people praised for qualities and damned for failings they've never had to take contemporary political reputations too seriously. And this is particularly in the case of staff speaking anonymously about each other or their contemporaries or their opponents. Sure. I find a great deal of inflation still to be gotten out of the Australian economy when it comes to staff talking about each other. So that's point one. Point two, the thing that I'm interested in getting your observation about is if I look at the Howard Office, leaving aside the Cabinet Policy Unit, which in truth was variable over time, and some of the claims that are made in some of the literature, I think reflect the aspirations of the holders of office rather than a correct accounting of actual activities at the time.
Yep.
So that's point one, perhaps that's point two. Point three is that if I look then at the Hawke and Keating years, and I think of Dennis Richardson as Bob Hawke's last Chief of Staff, and I think of people like Peter Barron or Bob Hogg, very significant, very effective political operators, and I look at the controversies of the Hawke and Keating years and the management of those controversies and the senior staff in those years who were very effective political players, very effective synthesisers of policy and administration and politics, all of which you need for good political management. I see improvements, and obviously under the leadership of Mr Howard, but I don't see quite the stark changes that are sometimes suggested, which I think reflect more parliamentary activity during the time Mr Howard was in office, media activity in the time Mr Howard was in office. So, for instance, Tony's two laws of Senate references committees, that Senate references committee reports are invariably linked to closeness towards an election and hyper-partisanship of the issue they're currently investigating. So many of those reports and journalists' reports and academics who write off journalists' reports and Senate references committee reports are full of inaccuracies, not necessarily your work, Anne, but just in general. There's an awful lot of puff in the system that feeds into commentary about who's who in the zoo, who's up, who's down, who did what and who didn't. And from my extensive experience, for instance, of Children Overboard, which I'll spare you today, there's so much rubbish in the literature that you could have half a dozen doctorates working full-time for the next 20 years just to correct the Howard literature on Children Overboard by itself. But my key point, and thank you for indulging me, Tom, and I'll sit down, is if I look back at the Hawke and Keating years and I look at their advisory structures, the quality of their people, some really good people, Peter Barron, Bob Hogg, very significant figures, I don't see the stark development that people see in the Howard years. I see a continuation and improvement, and as Jerry and others have said, under the tremendous leadership of people like Graham, obviously Arthur Sinodinos, who I once anonymously briefed out as the Prince of Chiefs of Staff, if David Kemp will forgive me.
Is that where it came from?
But really, if we come back to the key thing, I think there's developments. You can make criticisms, and I respect you as an expert in this area, but, I look back at the Hawke and Keating years, this idea that there was some dramatic change in sort of prime ministerial capacity, the sort of people in a Prime Minister's office, the skills and abilities that they could deploy to deal with political policy and other issues. I think it's more a continuum from Whitlam over time with improvements and changes, and I respect that you have views on some of them, but I just don't think it's as stark as presented, and I do appreciate, Tom, you giving me an extra minute to contribute my contribution. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Tony, so much. And I've got that letter, and I mentioned it to Tom. We might negotiate over making it available to the collection. And I was pleased to receive it. And I really respect that view that people shouldn't get above their station. I think one of the, there were so many points there, but let me just pick up a couple. The papers deposited here are going to allow us to see what happened and what was available and what people thought. And certainly I had actually pretty good access to people in the wake of that controversy, and under no illusions about the flow of information in some of that period from defence and so on. So it'll be excellent to be able to get into that data, to be able to look at it. You're quite right that problems and controversies did not begin in 1997 or 2001. They started to really show up from the later part of the Keating era, and maybe before, but certainly like the most egregious and obvious one was the pay television kind of controversy. So it's associated with I think people running around, getting close to elections, wanting to play games. But I think the accountability issues around animals was very problematic, and and I do trace that through in some of my stuff. In terms of the kind of significant shifts, the numbers do grow substantially when people move from here to Parliament House, the new Parliament House under Hawke, quite clearly. And I think Sandy Holloway has a quite nice line about, the capacity of the space. The staff will expand to the capacity of the space that's available. I think the decision to maintain a senior bureaucrat or someone with substantial bureaucratic experience was a good one in terms of managing the office under all of those things. Each of the Prime Minister, or each of the people that you've talked about, were the political fixers who really helped deal with the party and some of those issues. In that stream, there were the policy people, there were the kind of the administrative people and the media people, but those people were the real fixers. And I don't see, under more recent Prime Ministers, people of that kind of calibre and status sorting things out, which tells you something very interesting about the role of the parties in the capacity to provide those kinds of people. The shift, I think, may have been an unintentional one. In the Howard years, I mentioned that the tendency to kind of second people across from departments, which was at about 70% up through the Keating years and fell off dramatically after that, was an issue. You stopped using policy consultants. Different parts of the legislation kind of cover what you can use, so you stopped using those kinds of people. So I think issues managers proliferated, probably as changes in the media environment. So I'd kind of take those points on. And I can't wait to get into the papers when they're available and to sort of talk about these issues. But where the Chiefs of Staff, sorry, I just want to finish on your Chiefs of Staff study point. What was very interesting for people who haven't read the book or seen the book, we had the people who'd held the job together to talk about. I wasn't interested in personalities or gossip, I mean that was a bonus, but I was interested in the job and in how different people understood the job, how they did the job. And having them together was a pretty reasonable accountability. David, you were there. The atmosphere was tense when everybody sat down, but at the beginning some of the tension was on people's own side. And there was, as you say, much more continuity, much more commonality, much more of the same and persistent dilemmas that face officers as they try to do these things than partisan differences would suggest. Yeah.
Thanks, Anne. Please.